My name is Anna Rogers. I am from the University of Copenhagen, and this is a talk about the role of data curation in the current NLP models and whether it should even happen. The data curation is probably the most widely debated issue this year, especially after the paper on the dangers of stochastic parrots by Emily Bender, Timmy Gabru, and colleagues. The key question here is essentially defining the role, the goal of applied NLP. Do we aim for our models to just reflect the world as it is with all its imperfections, or would we like to improve what little we can, or at least try to not make things worse? The goal for this talk is to map out the debate for and against data curation, and then I will make the point that the case that the point is moot, that actually data curation is already happening, whether we like it or not, and the only thing that is up to us is how much effort we want to put in data curation. So let us start with the arguments for data curation. And the first one is, of course, the biases. There are many imperfections in our world. We have all kinds of social biases and discrimination against different social groups. And one way to help that is to construct training data so as to ensure that everybody is fairly represented and we do not propagate any harmful stereotypes. The second argument for data curation is privacy. We already know that our data, especially pre-training data for large language models, can contain sensitive private information, and we do not want the models to remember anybody's phone numbers. But it's actually a feature and not a bug. For example, we do want our models to represent certain facts about presidents, just not about private citizens. So then somebody has to decide what should be remembered and what should not be remembered, and that is clearly a data curation issue. The third argument is security. It has been shown that it is possible to attack NLP models by modifying their inputs with what is called universal adversarial triggers. This is phrases that can make the model to always predict a certain output. For example, there is a popular question answering dataset that is called Quad, and it is possible to construct such an input that you can prepend to any text you feed into a Quad trained model, and then no matter what question you ask, this model will always predict that the answer is to kill American people. So probably any dataset has such a vulnerability. These phrases do not have to be to make sense to human readers, but it may happen to be something that can be just discovered by users of a certain model accidentally, and then it is in the interest of the deployer to find out if there are such vulnerabilities and modify the data so that it would be unlikely to occur naturally. Because these triggers, they depend on the training data and not on the model itself. Last but not least, we need to better curate our data to make more informed choices about what is in our training data, just to make progress towards natural language understanding. So far, a lot of resources that are used in NLP are different convenience samples, for example, large collections of web texts, or it is data sets that are crowdsourced with minimum instructions. And the thing that is common in both of these types of resources is that we do not try to ensure representation of specific types of reasoning or linguistic phenomena. But then the result is lots of research which shows that our current models are vulnerable to annotation artifacts and various spurious patterns which are contained in our training data. Then we have models that are insensitive to basic perturbations. For example, it can be a sentiment analysis model which just does not switch positive sentiment to negative even if the input is modified to be negated. We also know that just by virtue of how linguistic phenomena are distributed in naturally occurring data, our models are struggling to learn rare phenomena. And that means that unless we make more effort to represent the rare phenomena in our training data, our models are probably not going to learn that. Now, on to the counter arguments. So, what are the arguments against data curation? And the first one is that, well, we do not need to curate the data if we actually just want to study the world as it is. And this is a valid argument. But then, of course, the goal of such research would be discovering linguistic or social properties of the current data as it is. But this is not the goal of applied NLP research. The second counter-argument is, well, we don't need to curate our data if our samples are already large enough. But I would argue that this is actually not the case, because even though our current corpora are very large, such as the Common Pro-based training corpora for language models, this is still not a representation of the human speech globally. The web texts, for example, they represent the speech by the people with the means, with leisure and interest in expressing themselves on the internet, and that's not the same as everybody on the planet. So if we want something that is representative of human speech globally, then we do need to curate the data so as to not introduce the bias towards the people who are already well represented in written text, for example. The next counter-argument is that we do not need to curate the data if we might be able to address the issues algorithmically. So there's lots of research on different bias mitigation techniques, and maybe if we can use some such techniques to mitigate biases, then we do not need to do all the hard work. So I would say that this is an empirical question, whether this is possible. So far, it is fair to say that algorithmic solutions have not been sufficiently effective. So maybe we would be in a situation in which they are not even, it is not an either-or situation. Maybe we could use data curation and bias mitigation techniques as something complementary and something that could work in a team to solve the issues that the other approach that cannot solve. The next argument against data curation is that, well, fundamentally this is just not what we set out to do. This whole deep learning enterprise was about the unreasonable effectiveness of data. And if we go back on that, if we start very carefully defining everything that goes in the training data, then maybe fundamentally we would not be better off than in the 1960s. And this is, again, a fair point, but it is unclear how far this unreasonable effectiveness of big data can take us. So far, deep learning has been very successful in closed world settings like chess and Go, but less so in messy, ambiguous data with undesirable patterns like social biases. So maybe there will be algorithmic solutions that will overcome that, but so far we have not really got away from the principle of garbage in, garbage out. we may be able to sort the garbage and learn from garbage data anyway, but we usually need to at least understand what kind of garbage we have to work with. And the final objection to curation is that it just sounds as something dystopian. When we curate, we effectively decide what are the social and linguistic categories that should be included and excluded in the training data. And that is essentially designing a world. And if we do that, we take on a role that is obviously very difficult ethically, and generally we do not want for anybody to impose their choices on the rest of us. And I agree with that argument 100%. But I'd like to point out that this is actually exactly what we are already doing right now. When we decide what data goes into the next large language model, which serves a global audience, we are effectively making choices for all those people. So if we want to get away from the one corpus fits all solution, then we need to know what are the linguistic and social identities of different populations, and we need to adjust for that. The fact is that there is no linguistically or socially neutral corpus that would fit everybody on the planet. And we always make data choices, even if we are not aware of them. So when we say that we don't want to do data curation, what we are actually saying is that we are doing data curation, but we just are not aware of what choices we have made. And this is important because our conceptual and linguistic repertoire is dynamic. We keep learning, we keep updating how we think and how we talk our entire lives based on what we hear from our friends, our neighbors, the people we hear on TV, people we interact with in daily life. And this is going to change because right now, more and more speech that we encounter in our daily life is going to be synthetic. Consider that GPT-3 is currently generating 4.5 billion words a day in games, customer support, and other applications. So it probably has already reached more ears globally than Shakespeare has in centuries, with all the schools and theaters. And all of that is going to change the world, and it could change the world for better or for the worst. So what are the bad things that could happen? For starters, people might start to increasingly talk and think the way that they know that NLP systems can understand. And then not talking and thinking that way will have social and economic and time costs to everybody who thinks and talks differently. And that might lead to amplification of existing power structures and inequality. And another unintended consequence might be the loss of social linguistic diversity and creativity. Just because people know that a certain way to formulate a question will get them the answer, they might be incentivized to always ask questions this way rather than go something more creative. So that's the worst case scenario, but also we could change the world for the better. The NLP systems could be truly personalized and something that can adapt to a wide range of social linguistic patterns. We could strive to nudge the users towards creativity and learning rather than mindless entertainment. We could create teacher aids which would have infinite time and memory and attention to help all the students. We could create all-knowing and impartial research systems and decision support systems, something that would help us humans to not fall prey to our biases and limitations of our memory. If we are to try to steer the process in that direction, in what little way we can, we will need to rethink how interdisciplinary NLP is and how interdisciplinary it should be. And here's a few suggestions what I think could help for the academic community. We need to create incentives for serious data analysis work. We have huge debt in documentation and analysis of the current resources while we have been publishing all the modeling papers. To be able to do such work, we need to update the NLP curricula. It shouldn't be just machine learning, it should be broadened to relevant aspects of linguistics and psychology and social science. And to help the students think about all of these issues from start, we could establish interdisciplinary collaborative networks where the students would not just exchange skills and projects led by somebody from one field, but they could actually formulate research questions during the ground up. And one issue that very often comes up when people talk about why we even need this AI ethics statements and considering broader impacts is that, we just don't really know how to weigh the pros against the cons. And yes, this is difficult, but this is just an area in which we need to start seriously working together with fields like law and governance and economics. And I believe the best place to start doing that would be in a dedicated track in machine learning in the conference, where we could interact with such experts and think together about possible intended and unintended consequences of what we're doing. So this all concerns academia, but obviously industry also has a huge role to play. And here are some other things which I think would be helpful. So it would be great if the people starting their own companies would start by considering how the product would change the world in the best and worst case scenario. And for what user population the product should be expected to work well. If you have to guarantee that your NLP system is producing the expected output 100% of the time, then what are the linguistic and social subgroups that might interfere with that goal, which you will need to explicitly take into account in your training data? And do you actually have the in-house expertise to answer all of these questions? And speaking of the expertise, one way in which the world has been changed is by NLP Job Ads. For years, we have seen job ads for NLP positions, which would require a degree in computer science or physics, and knowledge in Python, and knowledge in machine learning. But so far, few of such ads have mentioned any prerequisite knowledge of linguistic or social linguistics or ethics or pragmatics. And the result is that right now we have a pretty large workforce which has a fairly uniform set of skills. So right now, if the wind starts seriously blowing in the direction where we need to make NLP systems more interpretable, coming with certain guarantees of how they need to work for different social groups, then we actually do not have enough people who have the knowledge and the skills for how to audit the systems, how to identify the phenomena that need to be represented in the training data. So one way in which we could start changing the world is by changing how we formulate the job ads, because then the universities will respond and start broadening the curricula for NLP tracks, and then we will have the workforce that is more up to date with more interpretable and more ethical AI. So thank you, and the slides for this talk are available on my website, and you can also see the full paper at ACL Ontology. Thank you very much.